Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Professor Ivan Katchanovski. Ivan Katchanovski teaches at the School of Political Studies and Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He was visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, visiting assistant professor at the Department of Politics at the State of University of New York at Potsdam, Post-Doctoral fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and last but not least, Kluge Post-Doctoral fellow at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. His academic publications include several books and book chapters and also many scientific academic articles. He received his PhD at the George Mason University under the direction of Seymour Martin Lipset. Dear Professor Ivan Katchanovski, I thank you very much, and I'm very glad and honored that you found the time to talk to the Varna Peace Institute.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let me start with a personal question. What moved you personally to do research in the field of political science? What interests you personally in political science?
I was always interested in politics since I was a child, like about 10 years of age. I wanted to study politics. I was watching all the political programs then in the Soviet Union and in Western Ukraine, but actually it was not possible to learn much about the actual politics because of system. The Soviet system was not democratic and there was no freedom of information. But because my family experience politics themselves, and I learn about them from them about World War II, about the Nazi genocide, about ethnic cleansing after World War II, about Soviet massacre, about the UN and UPA. So I was very interested in such topics, and I wanted to study politics. And I wanted to go to university and to learn about politics, but because it was not possible, so I could I considered other options, and in particular, I went to Kiev Economics University because to study any political subject, you have to get a recommendation from the regional party committee in the Soviet Union, and it was I could not do such a recommendation. I could not get such a recommendation because I was not involved in any party activity. I was not a party member, and I wanted specifically to apply to Institute of International Affairs or Relations at Kiev University, and I went there and asked about what kind of documents I have to submit, and I was told to go to meet the secretary of the Communist Party Committee, and who immediately told me, this was 1988, he immediately told me that I cannot even, do not even think about applying there or going to school there. And this was kind of just a response. So you cannot even apply if you wanted to study. And this was very interesting because at the same time, at the end of 1980s, there was this small department at Kiev University of International Affairs included Poroschenko, who became later president of Ukraine, and Mikhail Saakashvili, who became president of Georgia. So they were able somehow to get recommendations from regional party committees, and were able to get access to the university. And at the time, I also attended demonstrations, first demonstrations actually in Kiev in the fall of 1988. I went to first demonstration, which was a real opposition demonstration, and included only about few dozen people. This was actually, I think, as far as I know, this was first political opposition demonstration, and afterwards I went to other demonstrations, and because I was interested in politics, but also I wanted to to support a democratic system in Ukraine in transition to democracy. So this was not possible for me to study political science or politics. So I wrote my dissertation, not dissertation, then undergraduate thesis at my university, based on Western economic theories and a theories of Max Weber, who was my favorite political sociologist at the time. And when I just submitted my proposal to the university, my advisor immediately told me that this is not possible to do. You cannot publish this, or you cannot even submit this in 1990. So he took me and they kind of introduced me to chair of the department, and chair of the department told me basically that they would expel me from university if I would write my undergraduate thesis. So this was 1990, January of 1990. So this is kind of real situation, and then I wrote it anyway. I wrote my undergraduate thesis using books like from Western economists like John Marshall, who was actually a classical economist. And I went to my university library and I had to cut actually a book which was published, I think, in around 1921. And I had to use kind of basically to cut pages, literally, because nobody opened the book, which was published in 1921, but nobody opened this book. So I had to use such books and so on. And I published, I wrote my thesis, and after this, the political situation in Ukraine somewhat changed. It was became more kind of glasnost a little bit in Ukraine in the middle of 1990. So I was not expelled from university, but I was given C, from basically C grade, which is kind of close to failure, but not yet failure. And even so, I had all excellent marks, so I could not go to university for graduate school in the Soviet Union at the time. But after a while, in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, so I went to study at the Central European University in Prague, which was just opened. And afterwards, I went to the United States, and I was always interested in kind of in a scientific approach to study of social sciences. So I thought at the time that economics, in particular economic theories like public choice, which and Austrian economics, which were also considering kind of economics not as pure science, but basically as field, but in interaction with political science and politics. In such cases, I was interested in this field, and I went to study at George Mason University for graduate program. But then I learned actual economics, which was taught at George Mason by professors, in particular by Nobel Prize winner James Buchanan. Actually was quite different from from real kind of issues which interested me. And I remember I went to a lecture from this Nobel Prize winning economist James Buchanan, and he told immediately to the entire class that because modern economics is not able to explain what was going in the Soviet Union in terms of economic transition, so he would not discuss these issues altogether. So, and this was my interest in the kind of in this transition in the Soviet Union, post-Soviet countries. So that's why I decided to switch to kind of political science, and I moved to a program which was then included Simon Martin Lipset and Francis Fukuyama, another political scientist. And I specifically wanted to study under Lipset because of his kind of approach was very similar to what I was interested in. Particular, I consider this tradition of Max Weber and classical sociologists who basically apply their theories to political science. So that's why I became kind of interested in politics and political science, and how I became professor.
It's very interesting and also very moving, inspiring story, because he was restrained by the authoritarian regime. You could not study what you want, and yeah, it's very inspiring also.
Yes, and in particular because also I learned my family, my mother, she lived in 5 countries, never moving on her own. So because of politics change, you have political borders which change different countries, and so and they were never interested in politics themselves. They never participated in any politics, but actually politics affected their lives. That's why I consider politics is very important kind of to study, and that's why I realized my dream, and now I'm studying politics, which I consider this is not just my job, this is my, how to say, hobby, because this is what I like to do. So I do not consider this kind of as a job. This is kind of really very interesting subject. And I consider politics, in particular politics of Ukraine, is even more interesting than Hollywood movies, because in Hollywood movies you almost always know happy end, like in the end, but in actual real politics, this is actually even more fascinating to learn and to study, to do research about, and also there is no happy end always. This is a big difference.
I totally agree with you. I also study political science, and for the same reasons, it's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, it's amazing how the regime changes and system changes, and yeah, how power structures works. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So before we turn to the Maidan issue and before we go into your research, you have detailed empirical studies and so on. But before we go to this, I would like to ask you some questions so that we can give our viewers an overview and to show the audience something like a timeline. So that they can put things and facts in a historical perspective. So let's talk about the historical background of the Ukraine so that we can understand the Ukrainian conflict better.
And actually, I did this for my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation, PhD dissertation at George Mason University under the action of Simon Martin Lipset on this topic of regional political divisions in Ukraine. And I specifically look how historical legacies affected current politics in Ukraine. And Ukraine has very very diverse history, depending on time period and depending on which part of Ukraine we are talking about. Because historically, Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, used to be part of the Russian Empire for a very long time, since Bogdan Khmelnytsky union with Russia, and basically Russian incorporation of Eastern Ukraine, and later taking control over southern Ukraine as well, incorporating these regions of Ukraine into the Russian Empire. And in contrast, Western Ukraine, in particular Galicia, became part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there was a region of Galicia, and Bukovina and Transcarpathia in Western Ukraine became part of basically Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had very different policies, very different political system, and also different conditions and different specific historical experiences of Ukrainians. And after World War I, after the collapse of the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were also very significant regional differences in terms of history of Ukraine. So Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and Southern Ukraine, and also and basically one region of Moldova became which is now linked to Transnistria region of Moldova. They became part. Then which was then part of Ukraine. They became part of the Soviet Ukraine, and they were part of the Soviet Union since basically foundation of the Soviet Union and after Civil War, since the beginning of 1920s. And in contrast, Western Ukraine, all these regions, Bukovina, Galicia, and also Western Ukraine, Volodymyr in Western Ukraine, my native region of Volodymyr, they became a part of either Poland, like Galicia and Volodymyr became part of Poland, and Transcarpathia became part of Czechoslovakia, and Bukovina became part of Romania. So before World War II, these regions also had very unique political systems, policies, and experiences in these regions were very different from the Soviet Union experience, which basically included most of Ukrainians and most of Ukraine. And Ukraine became basically took similar territorial borders after World War II as a result of World War II, and in particular Soviet German pact in 1939, when Western Ukraine was incorporated into the Soviet Union, with the exception of Transnistria region, which still was part of Czechoslovakia but became controlled by Hungary, which was ally of Nazi Germany. And then, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, all these regions became part of the Soviet Ukraine. With exception, there was one exception: Crimea was a part of the Russian Federation in the Soviet Union, and only in 1954 it became transferred to Ukraine because of decision by Nikita Khrushchev, who was leader of the Soviet Union and Soviet Communist Party at that time. So this is how Ukraine became modern, and independent Ukraine became in 1991 after the collapse or during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I remember this time also because it's also very fascinating to see there was a coup attempt in the Soviet Union in August of 1991. And at the time there were demonstrations in Moscow, but everything was very quiet in Ukraine. In particular, in Kyiv, I saw like parliament, watching the parliament, and all the opposition basically immediately became quiet. And then a leader of the parliament of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, who was a communist, high-ranking communist leader in charge of propaganda and agitation, also basically did not even oppose this coup. So there was very quiet, basically reaction, trying to basically sit and wait what would happen, and not to oppose this kind of attempt to kind of overthrow Gorbachev by hardliners in the Soviet Union. And even in Western Ukraine, where I was then based, because I could not go to graduate school, so I was working in the financial department in Lutsk, in Western Ukraine, in Volodymyr, and there were no demonstrations and went to any like visible opposition to this coup. This was again very strange, because kind of Western Ukraine was always more kind of anti-Soviet and more kind of likely to express their kind of opposition to the Soviet system. But then everything was quiet, and things dramatically changed in a few days after the defeat of the coup, and after Moscow was again under control of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Basically, then basically communist dominated parliament in Ukraine, along with nationalist opposition. They declared independence of Ukraine. So they basically switched their political position like in few days. This was like they would go from like you have communists and nationalists in Ukraine trying to communist majority in the parliament of Ukraine, basically clashing before August 19, before coup started in 1991, and then during a few days there was a quiet situation, basically everybody just trying to kind of to see and wait, and basically tacit acceptance of this coup. And afterwards you have all this kind of communists basically switching their sides and becoming kind of nationalists and supporting independence of Ukraine. So this was kind of such fascinating development to see basically the same people basically just taking opposite positions in just few days. And this is, for me, this was also importance of politics, because kind of otherwise it would be very difficult to explain why people behave in such a way. So this is how modern Ukraine became, and real independence of Ukraine was only since 1991, and this kind of basically lasted for a very long time until the Maidan in 2014, which led basically to what I consider breakup of Ukraine into different regions, and kind of an annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation.
Yeah, and another point is the cultural and ethnical division in Donbass and in this Lugansk, and also in the Crimea region. You can see there are more ethnic Russians, and so there is also I think people watch more Russian TV than Western TV, and so on and so forth. So the influence of Russia in this region is also is very great even today. And also economically, the big industries are also tied with the Russian economy.
So, yes, this was also because Ukraine has a very large ethnically Russian minority before this conflict started, and in particular in Crimea, ethnic Russians were a majority. So there were most of the population of Crimea was ethnically Russian, and a similar situation was in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where Russians comprise about half or almost half of the population. But a lot of actually people actually in Ukraine who kind of consider themselves even Ukrainians or reported themselves as Ukrainians in the census, actually they were from mixed families. So there were a lot of intermarriages between Russians and Ukrainians before Maidan, and I think and after the Maidan. And this kind of important difference was that Russians, but ethnic Russians only kind of were significant kind of minority in Donbass, or close to majority or plurality of population in Donbass, and there were majority of population in Crimea. So these two regions also historically supported separatists, even since collapse of the Soviet Union, and even before collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But there is another division which is also important, linguistic division, because almost half or about half of the population of Ukraine speaks Russian as their main language. And even so, the ethnic language, most of people in Ukraine, more than 70% of people in Ukraine say that their native language is Ukrainian. Only about half of the population spoke Ukrainian as their kind of main language. So Russian language is dominated in many regions of Ukraine, in particular in eastern Ukraine, like Kharkiv, Odessa, in southern Ukraine, and also to a significant extent in Kyiv. So this was actually another cleavage, basically. And there were also other economic cleavages because eastern Ukraine, in particular Donbass, were more economically developed compared to western Ukraine, which was more kind of agricultural region and less economically developed and less prosperous.
Yeah. So now that we showed a timeline and historical background, let's dig deeper. And now I have very complex questions. First of all, let's begin with the big question. How would you describe the war in the Ukraine? What is it all about? Can we call it a proxy war between Russia and the West? Is it a separatist war? Is it a civil war? So by definition, what kind of war is it? And what are the central motives for it? Yeah, maybe most important, how does everything begin in 2014?
Okay, this is a very interesting and important issue, and I think one of the central issues for Ukrainian politics. And actually, I researched the issue because, as I mentioned, I wrote my dissertation, PhD dissertation on this topic of regional political divisions in Ukraine, and I particularly looked for issue of separatism. And I argued in my book and in my publications, other publications before Maidan, that actually Ukraine is a very regionally divided country, and one of the most regionally divided countries in the world. And this was dangerous, and there was a possibility of civil war in Ukraine. And at that time, only few other people, kind of expressed similar view among academic community in the West. And this was after I published my book in 2006, after the Orange Revolution. So when this conflict in Donbass happened, I continued to research this conflict from the start. And I was watching all the developments each day, so it took a long time just looking into a variety of sources, trying to determine the availability and validity and so on. And I can say, based on my research and publication of my article in a peer-reviewed journal on this subject of the war in Donbass, and actually this article is one of the most cited, one of the few among most cited articles on the conflict in Donbass, and the most comprehensive article, which is looks in all aspects of the conflict in Donbass, and how it started, how it should define this conflict, and so on, and involvement of other countries. So I can say that based on my own research, academic research, this conflict can be classified as a civil war, with Russian military intervention in August of 2014 and in winter of 2015. So this is classic civil war. Basically, if you look into comparative perspective and compare Ukraine with similar countries which experience civil wars and also foreign interventions, like for instance now Syria, as one example, there is a civil war, but also foreign intervention by Turkey, US, Iran, and so on, Israel. So you have many kind of foreign countries intervening in this conflict. There was also civil war in Spain, with similar foreign intervention, and many other, like in Bosnia, in Congo, for instance, and so on. So this is a classic civil war with foreign intervention, and this is how we can classify this conflict. And this war started actually in basically in the beginning of 2014 in Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, after the Maidan, after the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government. So this was, according to my research, this was main reason for this conflict starting in Donbass, because party of regions, which including President of Ukraine, then Viktor Yanukovych, they were mostly based in Donbass. They represented this region, and and they were in power basically in Ukraine during the Maidan, but they were overthrown using a violent, basically Maidan Massacre, and this led to kind of people, specifically pro-Russian activists in this region trying to form kind of separatist kind of state and to secede from Ukraine and use military support from Russia, from Russian volunteers. So this conflict started as an internal conflict in response to violent overthrow of the pro-Russian government, and this kind of a movement for independence of Donbass was led, and for autonomy of Donbass was led by separatists, basically by local separatists in Donbass, with support of Russian volunteers, including this kind of armed group led by Igor Girkin, or Stilkov, which is very famous, and also later by Russian regular military in August of 2014, and by also Russian military intervention in winter of 2015. But according to my analysis, for instance, looking into a variety of data, a variety of sources like videos, interviews, media reports from different sources, from statistical data, I can say that absolute majority of fighters of separatist formation in Donbass are local, and they are Ukrainian citizens, and this applies to leaders of these formations and also applies to members of these formations. So in one, for instance, data set which was published in government link, basically Meritorious website in Ukraine, and was leaked or basically hacked from separatist sources from separatist control part of Donbass. They included data, families, basically names, first and last names, and citizenship and other information from about 1,400 members of armed formations in Donbass. And according to this data, which I analyzed, about 80% of them were actually Ukrainian citizens, and Russian citizens were about 17%, and a few other percent were citizens of other countries. So this is absolute majority of actually separatist fighters are local Ukrainian citizens, and they also were joined by some Ukrainians who opposed Maidan in other regions, in particular from Odessa region or Kharkiv region after the Maidan.
There are several scholars. For example, Professor Thomas Jäger, who pointed out the importance of the pipeline project Nord Stream 2, which is for several reasons geopolitical and geostrategical, very relevant topic. He also speaks about the regime change. Then there is the scholar Edward Lozansky, who also pointed out that the Ukraine is of vital geopolitical interest for the USA, and he cited Zbigniew Brzezinski and Friedman from Stratford, and so on and so forth. And then there is this researcher, Gordon Hahn, who talks about a neo-fascist coup, and talks about a cover-up story of the Maidan Massacre in Western media, and so on and so forth. So would you agree that there is some Cold War rhetoric? Would you agree that the media is also involving in some cover-ups and maybe propaganda, we can call it, from both sides, from the Russian side and from Western media also? Would you agree with this analysis from the scholars, or is your analysis a little bit different, or is it or opposed to this kind of thinking?
I actually analyze all these issues. I research politics of Western media coverage of post-communist countries, including Ukraine, even before this conflict, and I follow these issues myself. And I examine Maidan as well, in transition in Ukraine, and what happened during the Maidan, and how we can classify Ukraine from the perspective of the political system in Ukraine before and after Maidan. So I look into all these issues, and I have my own perspective, which is, again, based on my own research, and also about media coverage, which is also very important, because I can say that the issue of propaganda, basically propaganda and fake news, or kind of using classical term in conflict studies, disinformation, basically, which is very used often in a lot of conflicts, is basically used by governments not only of Russia, but also Western governments, but also government of Ukraine. And this is in Ukraine in particular. If you follow the news media or politicians, they often just talk about war with Russia. They would deny civil war in Ukraine. Basically, they call Maidan as a revolution of dignity, which is actually a term which was invented by a politician from Svoboda party. But this is kind of official propaganda, official narrative. And a lot of Western media basically supported this narrative for political reasons, because Western governments also rely on propaganda and disinformation for their own foreign policy orientation and reasons. So they supported this kind of violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government during the Maidan, and also they supported current policies of the Ukrainian government, in particular supported Ukrainian government and its policies during the civil war in Donbass. And just to give you one example of such propaganda and disinformation, which I'm going to publish also very soon, because this is just part of my research. Again, this is a very fascinating case from Maidan Massacre. The famous icon of Maidan Massacre was female medic who was wounded during the Maidan, and she was shown in all the major media like CNN, Deutsche Welle, like Guardian and Daily Telegraph and other like Washington Post and so on. So a lot of Western media and almost all Russian media, I'm sorry, not Ukrainian media, and even Russian media mentioned her like and showed her as kind of a symbol of Maidan Massacre. And this was kind of very important story, and also a very interesting development, because on social media she also became extremely popular, because immediately after she was being wounded, she was running and she tweeted, basically, kind of tweeted that I'm dying. So this became a viral tweet, and after this she traveled to France. So she was meeting with the president of France and giving like hundreds and hundreds of foreign media interviews and Ukrainian media interviews. So this was kind of just example of of what happened during the Maidan. She was an icon. Basically, she was female medic, young female medic, and this was kind of story which was kind of reported by them, all the media. Take it for granted, because this is what happened. Like this is like they just took her words basically, and politicians who accompanied her, like Poroschenko in particular, or current mayor of Kiev, Kluge, Vitaly Klitschko. So they took this their claims without any verification, and they just basically repeated this as this is what actually happened. But according to very recent developments, she just testified at the Maidan Massacre trial, which I researched, and also there was one Ukrainian journalist who called her recently, using basically in kind of prank, basically pretending that he was from actually from leadership of Maidan self-defense, and during this kind of phone call, she basically agreed that with him that she was not wounded, actually, that she basically staged wounding, that this was fake wounding, and he basically said that we need to cover up this wounding, and she agreed. She would kind of with him, and he offered her to, from a kind of behalf of a leader of Maidan, to move to the United States to go to study, and she said, I do not know even English language and so on. So this was kind of just information what kind of was given in her interview, and this was also consistent with the fact that her wound was very strange, because she said that she was wounded in her neck, and she showed this from left to from right to left side, and they were kind of immediately after this she was giving interviews, she was tweeting, running, and she said that even she did not feel any kind of wound, kind of been wounded and so on. This was very strange, because I was researching Maidan Massacre, and I saw these people who were actually wounded and killed, in particular in their neck. They could not basically even walk. They immediately would fall, and many of them were dying and on the spot. This was very strange. And then also tweeting, this was just looking as too good to be true, the story, basically. This is like Hollywood movie. If you see some very bad movie, it kind of sometimes imagination, it looks like a kind of just basically not a real something. So because kind of it was looking just to be very good to be true, and that's why kind of after this event happened, So I was waiting to see if this would be confirmation from her testimony during the Maidan Massacre trial, and she just gave recently testimony and in which she actually testified as witness. She did not testify as a victim of the Maidan Massacre. So she testified as witness because another protester near her was killed, basically. In just 1 minute after she was running, this protester was killed, and near her, exactly the same spot, and on the Maidan, and she testified as witness, basically. And during this testimony, she basically did not say that there were any kind of confirmation that she actually wounded. She did not provide any confirmation. She basically tried to repeat her story, even so she admitted to kind of Ukrainian journalists that she was not wounded, and also basically she had the status of witness and not victim. So this means even government investigation did not treat her as wounded. But again, very interesting that she testified during her interviews, and also in particular during this Maidan Massacre trial, that she was wounded from the action of Hotel Ukraina, which was actually controlled then by Maidan forces. And this is very important because even kind of either way, if you kind of consider that she basically faked her wounding, or if she actually was wounded, this is basically the same kind of situation. I'm not sure which one is worse, because actually one protester was killed, and because she was wounded from basically Maidan control of Ukraine, according to her testimony, or she staged her wounding according to other evidence, which is includes her admission. And this is not only her admission, because this Ukrainian journalist said that he talked to some of members of Maidan self-defense, and they admitted that this was specifically staged. She was specifically selected because she had already kind of surgery on her neck before this massacre took place, and she was specifically kind of selected in order to kind of be a symbol of this massacre by the government forces, which were just killing and trying to kill even medics and so on. This was kind of very good story in terms of publicity, and this is what was reported by the media. And there was not a single report about actually her testimony at this Maidan Massacre trial, or about this Ukrainian journalist basically getting her admission that she basically staged her wounding. So this is what's happening. So now you have all this kind of information. If people just watch the media, they would have idea that this was actually massacre, this government forces wounded her, and just a female medic, and this was basically kind of what happened during the Maidan Massacre. And now actually, if you look in actual evidence, which are kind of what I am a scholar doing, this is actually quite opposite. So you have a case of basically of using her to stage kind of specifically to stage this kind of and blame the government forces for her wounding, specifically to elicit such emotion, and using media, in particular Western media, but also Ukrainian media, to repeat the story. And this was very successful because there are no reactions so far, and I would see actually if there would be any changes, which I do not expect after I'm gonna reveal her kind of testimony and her story as well, because there was a very similar story, another story of Ukrainian Maidan activist who was filmed and kind of mentioned by a lot of media, Western media in particular, that he was kind of taken as a hostage from the Maidan because he supported Maidan. He was leading Maidan activist and opposing to the government, and he was basically represented as being tortured, basically, and even crucified by this kind of evil kind of opposition members who were speaking like Russian, and not the Ukrainian Russian, but actual Russian. So this was also attempt to implicate Russia into his kidnapping and so on. And this was story again repeated by the Western media and so on, and Ukrainian media. And this was taken for granted. And when I was watching this story, even after this happened, I was doing research on Maidan during these events happened, and during this kind of story, when it became public, I immediately became suspicious, and I thought this looks like, again, this does not look very plausible. And immediately I was getting on social media like attacks. This is basically, I do not believe this and so on. This is like kind of a lot of people who kind of were basically motivated by their partisan loyalty or kind of political motivation. They immediately dismiss any question, any kind of even kind of need for evidence. But this was looking very strange because he did not provide any, this activist did not provide any kind of evidence that he was actually tortured or crucified and so on, but all the media reported, and his blood was looking very strange. He was saying that basically he was not eating anything, but he was again looking like normal person, just with his piece of hair was cut, and this was used as main evidence that he was tortured. And this was again very strange way to torture basically person basically leaving no trace. And this case involved also very high profile Maidan activists and politicians, in particular Poroschenko, who became president of Ukraine after the Maidan. He was also kind of, and Vitaly Klitschko, who was mayor of Kyiv after Maidan and was one of Maidan leaders. They basically kind of propagated his story of kidnapping and so on, and he was again kind of shown again a symbol of Maidan and a symbol of suffering, basically from the government persecution. But in fact, after Maidan, what happened? There was a government investigation, and government investigation, Ukrainian government police investigation determined what I actually kind of posted immediately after his kind of so-called crucifixion and kidnapping, that actually this crucifixion and kidnapping were all staged basically by him, with involvement of some other Maidan politicians. Because forensic examinations, they found that actually his cuts to his kind of fingers and to his hands were, and to his body were actually done without any infection. They were done with in sterile kind of medically sterile like environments. This was like as a surgery or something. Not to put any infection in his body. So this was kind of a most unbelievable kind of torture, to have torture somebody using kind of sterile instruments and so on. And he was claiming that he was basically there were nails in his like hand and so on. This was kind of disproven by forensic evidence, and even his colleagues from his after Maidan leadership, they testified to investigation that basically they believe that he was kidnapped, because not kidnapped, that this was basically kidnapping staged by him, because he told them that he would be basically disappear and so on before actually this event took place. So this is official Ukrainian police investigation, which was made public by a popular Ukrainian blogger, and this was also never reported by any Western media. And only, I think, just a few Ukrainian media sources just reported this. So this is again kind of image of what people know from the media and what actually happened is totally different. And this is just an example of how basically propaganda and misrepresentation of fake news can be used to successfully kind of manipulate information and achieve such goals, basically by supporting people who are involved in mass media or kind of staging such kind of misrepresentation, basically without any consequence. And this is what actually kind of my research is, why I consider this is so fascinating, because it's kind of, imagine that this can be happening in real life. This is kind of just how to say, it's kind of, it's more fascinating than Hollywood movies, because I haven't seen yet any Hollywood movie which would be kind of have such plot like this.
Real life is, and real politics is more interesting and yeah, maybe more crazy than Hollywood movies. And it's not the first time that we see such media campaigns and such propaganda campaigns and fabricated stories. Let's remind our viewers that Colin Powell lied in front of the United Nations that Iraq has weapons of mass destructions. Let's remind our viewers that there was this Nayirah testimony that was a false testimony given before the United States Congress of Human Rights caucus on October, I believe, in 1990. This 15-year-old girl, Nayirah, cried and was so emotional, and that was the reason behind the intervention. And furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of Kuwait public relation campaign, which was run by American public relation firm called Hill and Knowlton. So that was it was quite interesting. So it's not the first time that this happens in history. It happens all the time to legitimize a military intervention, to discredit an opponent, and yeah, so on and so forth. This is quite normal strategy, I believe, in human history. Yeah, it's amazing that this happens also in the Ukraine. And you also wrote in your article that the Ukrainian government and the media, to a large extent also the Western counterparts, attributed the rise of separatism in Donbass mostly to the direct military intervention by Russia. And your analysis show that much of this separatist conflict did not resulted directly from this direct Russian military intervention. So that it was a misinterpretation or even a fabrication. So things did not happen with the Russian intervention.
Yeah, I think this was kind of mostly like a fabrication or propaganda by the governments, which was also repeated by the Western media. And I remember at the start of this conflict when, for instance, where this just started, and there were reports by the U.S. government, for instance, by U.S. Secretary of State, and in the media, like New York Times, there were like Russian gunmen taking control over Slavyansk town in Donbass. So this was a story. Basically, they say they are the same gunmen, which who are looking like Russian special forces from Crimea, which were also called gunmen. So they were basically regular Russian troops without any insignia, and they say the same forces took control over strategic town of Slavyansk in Donbass at the start of this conflict. So this was kind of shown by the media, and they used some photos and so on, and showing some people who were similar, like to some people who were in Donbass. And this was like, for me, I was researching this, and I could not believe this, because this was kind of absolutely different, because you can recognize immediately like regular forces, like in Crimea, when this took place. I also gave interview and published. This was immediately clear they were regular Russian troops, even so they did not have any insignia. But in Donbass, this was very clear that they are not actually regular Russian troops. And all this basically evidence was fabricated, and New York Times were basically and other Western media were publishing this as actually this was taking place. And this is, and I tried to kind of just make corrections and so on, but basically media was not interested. They wanted to specifically to propagate the story. Basically, they this is in political communication. This is called indexing theory. Basically, the media basically follows narratives and about foreign conflicts, for instance, in particular, from their government or from their kind of elite. So this means if U.S. media would follow kind of either Democratic Party or Republican Party and their government or opposition, basically in representing this foreign conflicts, and if basically politicians from different parties would agree on certain conflicts, there would be no media basically coverage which would oppose this kind of narrative. And this is what taking place, because all major political parties in the US and other Western states basically agree on kind of on the same kind of narrative, the same kind of propaganda. So media basically kind of just repeat this and do not question even such fake news as what happened, for instance, with Slavyansk, because now it is proven beyond any kind of reasonable doubt that this actually there were no Russian gunmen or special forces in Donbass. Even so, Ukrainian government claim, Western governments claim, and media claim that actually now it's clear that they were led by a Russian retired FSB officer Igor Girkin or Silkov, and he included in his unit Russian volunteers who basically many nationalists, Russian nationalists like himself, and also Ukrainians who opposed Maidan, and they basically were a relatively small unit, and they took control over this town, and kind of, but they were not majority of the local fighters in Donbass, and they were not controlled by any kind of, there's no evidence that they were controlled by any kind of Russian security forces and so on, or they were armed by any Russian security forces, and also kind of, even so Russia supported basically kind of separatists from the start, but there was no evidence that they were just regular Russian troops and so on, as was claimed by the media. So this is just one example of how easy this is to misrepresent this, and even so now many people still who don't know this just claim that this is not a civil war in Donbass because they were like Russian gunmen or Russian regular military, Girkin and so on. Even so, he openly opposed like Putin, he openly criticized like Russian policy and so on, and he also was volunteer in Transnistria, in Bosnia war, supporting Serbian forces in Bosnia, local Serbian forces in Bosnia, and also in Transnistria region in Moldova, supporting also Russian separatists, like later happened in Donbass. So this is kind of information which is readily available, but it's still not kind of known by many people, and that's why a lot of perceptions of the conflict in Ukraine in the West are actually based on fake news or fake misrepresentation, which can be called by classical term disinformation and propaganda. So this is kind of just one example of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, you presented your study at the University of Alberta. It was a conference, I think organized by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where you looked at the major actors and the major factors who led to this violent conflict in Donbass. You looked at the incredible amount of data. You looked at all public videos that are available on the Maidan Massacre, if I remember correctly, plus 25 gigabyte unreported data of radio intercept and SBU alpha. You looked also very closely to the data of the special forces group called Omega, and so on and so forth, and eyewitnesses and so on and so forth. So you studied and analyzed this big data. What is the result? What can we learn from this data and from your analysis? For example, one belief is that the Berkut forces, the police, was violent at the time of the Maidan protests. And what is the role of the far-right sector, Azov battalion, and this ultra-nationalist Parubiy, I believe it's called, Ivan Bubenchik, and many others actors, and yeah. So explain to our audience what is your study telling us?
So this actually was example of my Maidan Massacre research. I presented this for the first time. I mentioned this study for the first time during this conference of Canadian Ukrainian Research Institute when I presented my paper on the conflict in Donbass. And I mentioned this Maidan Massacre study, which I also presented shortly before at the Ukrainian Studies Seminar at the University of Ottawa. And since then, I made a lot of other studies on this issue, and I kind of continued this research as of now. I'm watching this Maidan Massacre trial, which is a major source of information for what happened during the Maidan Massacre. So in addition to all these videos, like hundreds of gigabytes of videos, which are publicly available in different languages, which I saw and analyzed also kind of several hundred hours of videos from Maidan Massacre trial. They are still on YouTube, and I watch this almost each week because they're going to have a new session on Wednesday. So I'm going to plan to watch again this, analyze all this data, which are just incredible data, incredible amount of data, forensic evidence, testimonies of protesters who are wounded, eyewitnesses, and testimonies of kind of experts and so on. So this is just kind of sources of information which I analyze just enormous. And I did this research for actually since the start of the massacre, because I was watching massacre live when it was happened. This was late at night in Canada, but I was watching this because I was following all the violence during the Maidan, because this is a major area of my research. So I study conflicts, in particular political violence, and all armed conflicts in Ukraine. So that's why I follow the Maidan massacre, since it just was happening live, and then I continue doing this research right now, and now I presented in various conferences. In addition to this first conference, which I mentioned this presentation, I presented also at the American Political Science Association annual meetings in San Francisco and Boston, in conferences of American Association for Slavic and East European Studies in the United States, and also at American Association for Studies of Nationalities in New York and Columbia University, and also at conference at Uppsala University, which was organized by British Association for Eurasian and East European Studies and Institute of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. So this is kind of my ongoing research, and I plan to publish a book on this topic and a free article. And I already published a book chapter on this topic in academic publication, in academic book on the conflict in Ukraine, and I already also published an article in peer-reviewed journal, in a special issue of peer-reviewed journal on far right in different countries. So I published specifically on the issue of far right involvement in Maidan Massacre and other cases of violence. So I have a lot of evidence, basically all publicly available evidence, which I analyzed in my studies. This is kind of very time-consuming and takes a lot of time, but I can say based on my research, so there is kind of, how to say, there is no question now, this is beyond any physical possibility that Berkut would massacre Maidan protesters. So it's not physically possible. So this is, unless people would assume that Berkut or government snipers were invisible, or they were shooting from invisible weapons, which were flying like missiles, guided missiles, or something like drones, because actually all the videos which are available of the massacre, and which I posted also on my YouTube page and on my academic pages and presented at conference, they clearly show that actually times when Berkut special unit were shooting from, members were shooting from their Kalashnikov assault rifles and also from their pump non-lethal rifles. At the same time, protesters were not killed and not wounded. So this is just one or a couple exceptions, which also shows that in one case it's not clear, not certain based on the evidence, but in other cases the direction of the shooting did not coincide with actually the direction from which protesters were killed. So it's not physically possible to kill somebody, basically, if you have video which shows that actually police at the same time were not shooting. So because in order to shoot somebody, this is like very obvious. You need to have, like, you need to point your like weapon into them, and basically and there would be flash, like muzzle flash from kind of discharge from weapon, and so it would be very clear, immediately possible to see this. But videos which are the same videos like of the massacre, which include all the police positions and protesters who were shot and killed at the same time, they clearly show that actually police at that time were not shooting. So this is like, and they charged with the massacre. This is like just unbelievable. And there are also synchronized videos, which are synchronized videos from entire Maidan massacre, based on audio from Maidan massacre stage, so Maidan stage. They were like they were talking in loudspeakers almost during the entire massacre, and that's why it's possible to synchronize perfectly all the videos, like different videos of the massacre, into the same basic chronology over time, and then see actually what happened with kind of precision, with 100% basically precision. And this not only done by myself, there were actually videos synchronized, same videos basically synchronized by US civil architectural company. They did this on their own website, and by Ukrainian kind of anonymous group, which is kind of actually linked to Ukrainian Prosecution General Office and to kind of one political party which was involved in the Maidan massacre, and they actually synchronized such videos and posted these videos as also evidence that this was done by Berkut, but they posted them separately. So they did not show this at the same time. They show protesters shot separately and police shooting separately. This is like, because if you put them into the same kind of frame, just because of the content, this is like just basic kind of, and this is basically would be smoking gun, because you just show that police were shooting, policemen shooting, and then protester just falls to the ground. So this is what they needed to show. They could not show this. And this is not just accident, because they have such videos, they have such capacity, but they specifically do not do this because obviously if they would show this would immediately show that this actually video show opposite, that actually Berkut police did not massacre Maidan protesters, and there was actually somebody else who was shooting into them. And this is actually kind of evidence which is kind of would be most clear evidence. And in relation to this, there were also cases of, for instance, what my synchronized video shows that at least 3 protesters were shot and killed, and 10 protesters were wounded before even Berkut special unit just arrived to the Maidan massacre. So they were, but they are still charged with the Maidan, with murder of these protesters. So this is like happened. So you have people killed, even so, by police unit which not yet there. Because it's possible to take their like whereabouts when they arrived. They arrived after the protesters were killed, but they are still charged with their matter. And it's possible also to look into videos of government snipers, because government snipers units were also presented on the internet, like by the media in particular, as evidence that they were shooting, like they were killing protesters because they were with arms, they were pointing their arms into over direction, and the same was Berkut, were using kind of shooting with live ammunition, and this was like presented as definite evidence that they actually massacred Maidan protesters. But actually, government snipers arrived to the Maidan basically after almost all protesters were killed and shot. And after they arrived to the Maidan area, to the government-controlled area near the Maidan, actually this massacre basically almost completely stopped. And protesters started to be killed in faraway areas, which were controlled by the Maidan. So this is actually when government snipers arrived. So this means that snipers who were killing protesters, they were afraid to be identified and to be by actual snipers, government snipers. So they would start to kill few protesters, which including this medic, near this medic, who basically was a kind of famous icon of massacre. Another protester was killed according to testimonies presented during the Maidan Massacre trial and in videos by eyewitnesses. He was killed from main post office building, which was controlled then by right sector. So this is just one example of this. So just videos clearly show that kind of protesters could not be massacred physically, and also like there are videos which show, in addition to this timing of the massacre, there is also direction of the shots, because there were also kind of a lot of images of bullet holes in trees, in kind of flower boxes, and like in electricity poles from the direction of the government-controlled forces. And this was also presented as evidence that they basically massacred protesters because of such bullet holes. But actually, this is I went to the site of Maidan Massacre and I examined this issue, and I can say this is actually also shows this is that government forces do not massacre the protesters, because if you look into this, if you plot all these bullet holes, actually they show that actually on Hotel Ukraina, which was just behind protesters, located behind protesters, all the bullet holes are basically, with one or two exceptions, minor exceptions in different areas, they are actually at the level of second floor and up. So this means that all there were no bullet holes, basically with one exception, just maybe one exception, but in government investigation, forensic experts, they do not identify any bullet holes below second floor. And this is very important, because this means if you plot them, you can immediately see that all the bullet holes were just at the level which were above height of Maidan protesters. So this means Berkut were fighting, they were shooting into Hotel Ukraina, into windows, and in particular in top floors and roof of like 16-story basically hotel, or 14-story hotel, which is very top, and they were shooting above the height of protesters, or they were shooting also in trees, basically, or kind of objects, in order to kind of stop protesters. But many of the shots were also at a very high level, beyond height of protesters. So this means kind of that they could not physically shoot, because even if you look into videos of Berkut behind a truck, very large truck, a mass type which has I think 2.5 meters wide, it was physically impossible to shoot below from this truck, because you have basically kind of a police standing behind this truck and shooting. And this was also presented as evidence that they actually massacred protesters, but it's not physically possible to shoot below truck if you have 2.5 meters basically of kind of cabin from the truck in front of you. This is like, and this was basically blind zone. So protesters who were killed were basically in blind zone from the police standpoint, and this is shown also by kind of bullet locations above the height of protesters. So this is just one example, kind of, which shows also clearly that that protesters were not massacred by the government Berkut forces or by government snipers, and they were massacred by some other snipers which actually were located in government control buildings like Hotel Ukraina or Zhotnevy Palace and so on. And there are a lot of videos of snipers there. This is not just imagination, and actually government investigation and Maidan lawyers, they denied there were any snipers in Hotel Ukraina and in other locations controlled by the government. Even so, there are videos of these snipers, like BBC video which shows snipers in 11th floor shooting into the direction of Maidan protesters, and BBC journalists, and they're riding for cover and shooting snipers and pointing to this window on the 11th floor of the Hotel Ukraina, and then this floor would close, and this BBC correspondent reported this actually he saw a shooter who was wearing a Maidan-style green helmet. And this is just what was shown by the media, but I also look into all other media, and what I found that there was also Ukrainian television media report about the same window, in which a Ukrainian correspondent says that this from this window they film, and they actually show a film, basically a rifle with a sniper shooting into Maidan protesters in the back, basically. And he reports this in video, Ukrainian television video from a television channel. And this video included in my study, and there were also, I found also Ukrainian protesters who testified that they saw protesters being killed from the same window, shooting from the snipers in Hotel Ukraina, because it was not possible to shoot even in police direction from this kind of window, because it was located kind of parallel basically to government forces, and there was basically a blind zone for police was actually in blind zone from this window. But this window actually is also very important, because another protester who testified at the Maidan Massacre trial, he said that after, and he was also filming this BBC video, so he testified that after they ran away, and he had other protesters saying, this is actually they are our snipers, basically. These are our snipers in Hotel Ukraina. And he says afterwards, kind of he saw from one of the window in the Hotel Ukraina, there was a person with rifle who would just make a movement towards protesters, telling basically them by using his rifle and hands, basically telling them just basically not to shoot about the snipers in Hotel Ukraina, basically. So this basically just pretends there are no snipers, and this is just protester who testified that he witnessed this, and again no media reports. And then there was a video which was presented. A Belgian television video of the Maidan Massacre, which was presented at this Maidan Massacre trial, and I got this video from this Belgian television for my research afterwards. And this actually video was kind of full video, almost I think 1 hour long video of the Maidan Massacre, which was never broadcast by any television, any kind of media in its entirety, but which actually was most popular video of the Maidan Massacre, because it was broadcast by the media of all the media in the world, which I was, like most countries of the world, which I was looking to, like most Western countries, like Eurasian television networks, BBC, all the British television networks, German television, French television, Polish television, like I think even like Bulgarian television showed this video, and Ukrainian television many times as evidence that protesters were massacred. This was about 1 minute long video in which protesters would would go to the front, would advance in direction of the Berkut barricade, and then they would be massacred basically, and they would run away, and they would be shot. This was kind of very graphic video, which was presented again as evidence that they were massacred by the government snipers, by Berkut, or by SBU, or by Alpha SBU or Omega snipers from the government units. But actually, entire video, which is publicly available now, but is not shown by any media, shows actually that these protesters, why they would go there. There was no need to go there, and it shows very clearly, like at the beginning of the video, that they were led by 2 other protesters, basically. They did not want to go there because they testified that they know about snipers in the Hotel Ukraina, so they would just watch very carefully and wait, trying to go into the front, because opposite from them, there were actually already protesters who were massacred from the Hotel Ukraina. They were not willing to go there, and they were basically led by other protesters who would call them, yeah, let's go, just move to the front, and so on. And this was kind of basically leading, they were led to this massacre area. And afterwards, during this few minutes when they were moving and trying to go there, you can hear like one protester saying, do not go there, do not go to the front, because I saw that protesters were basically massacred from the Hotel Ukraina by snipers. I saw gun flashes there and so on. This is just, he was telling them, and they still would go to the front, and afterwards this bullet basically hitting their group and very narrowly missing them and hitting a tree, basically. This is one example when actually they were shot, and it's possible to see kind of in the video, and this bullet hole directly matches upper floors of Hotel Ukraina. So this again was not possible to shoot them from the front, but it was clearly shot from the behind. And the Belgian television journalist who filmed this, he said in his Belgian television interview that they actually were shot from the back. So he himself basically said they were shot from the back, and in the back there was Hotel Ukraina and different front, and this is just example of just such evidence. And then they would go to the front, and then they would be massacred. And this was presented. This part was presented as kind of as evidence that they were massacred by government forces. But actually, they testify. Most of them who survived, almost everybody who survived, and were wounded during the massacre from a group of about 12 protesters. They testified that they were shot from the Hotel Ukraina by snipers. They saw snipers there, and so on. They were not shot by the government forces. This is just an example of evidence, which includes all the videos, very clear. But in addition to this, the testimony of these protesters, this was not just accidental. I analyzed all the testimonies of wounded protesters at the Maidan Massacre trial. There were about 80 protesters with wounding of whom Berkut members were charged, and absolute majority of them actually testified that they were shot by, not by the Berkut, but they were shot by snipers in Maidan control buildings like Hotel Ukraina or Zhitnevy Palace and so on. And or they saw snipers there, or they were told by other protesters about snipers there during the Maidan massacre. So this is just one example. Even testimonies, even like people who actually were wounded, absolute majority of them testified during the investigation or Maidan massacre trial that they were wounded not by the Berkut police, but by the government, by the snipers in the Hotel Ukraina and other buildings which were then controlled by the Maidan forces. So this is just example. In addition to this, there are testimonies of several dozen of persecution witnesses who actually were used by persecution and by the Maidan massacre lawyers or Maidan protesters as evidence that they actually massacred, that these protesters were massacred by the Berkut, but actually these witnesses actually testified. Several dozen of them, majority, testified that they were snipers in Hotel Ukraina and other locations controlled by the Maidan. So all members and all commanders from government sniper units, like from SBU, Alpha unit of SBU and Omega unit, and other units of sniper forces from the government, they testified during this Maidan massacre trial as persecution witnesses, and they actually testified that they did not saw any evidence that the protesters were shot by Berkut or government forces, and they testified that they actually had ordered to go to Maidan, to be deployed to Maidan area after the massacre already started. They received evidence that the protesters were massacred by the police, that police were actually massacred by snipers in the Music Conservatory building, and that they were deployed specifically to locate and neutralize snipers who were massacring police. And this is how massacre started. And they arrived there. There was actually, after they arrived, they testified that they could not see any snipers, because basically what I showed, that basically snipers kind of started to hide or move to another locations, and because actually government snipers were able to locate them, so they tried to hide and so on. And actually, according to my research, and now which is confirmed by government investigation, massacre started from the Maidan massacre started with massacre of the police, and this was done by snipers who were located in the Music Conservatory, which was located just next to Maidan stage, and the Maidan was controlled by special unit of which was called Special Maidan Self-Defense Company, which was connected to far-right sector, and this unit basically included the snipers, and they actually, in the BBC video, it's possible to see them kind of photos from Ukrainian journalists who went there, and he filmed like basically people who have like hunting rifles and also kind of Kalashnikov-looking type of weapons, which can be hunting version of Kalashnikovs, basically inside of Music Conservatory about this time when the police started to be shot, and this is. And then you can see police basically shot, and they point also to Music Conservatory. Journalists point to Music Conservatory, and there are kind of videos which show from Ukrainian television which show snipers in the Music Conservatory shooting, and this is kind of this taking place, and this is what I was watching. But all the videos actually live videos disappeared, and only there are now a few recordings of this from this time. But I was able to kind of reconstruct these events, and it's very clear that there were snipers who were shooting kind of police, and this is how massacre started, and this is how police retreated, because few of them were killed on the Maidan, and then many wounded, and that's why they retreated, and then protesters were shot by snipers again from the Maidan controlled buildings. And this is also very important, because there is also very interesting another just example of how media can misrepresent this. I got a raw video from CNN footage from the archive from my research, and this video also were not shown by any television, including CNN. And in this video, you can see like the same group of snipers who were, including this sniper whom you mentioned, who later admitted in Ukrainian television that he shot actually and killed Berkut police during the massacre. He was member of this armed company based in Music Conservatory, and then you see them about in a few dozen minutes, they moved to the front of CNN cameramen, CNN journalists who were filming this, and they just walked near them with their kind of hunting rifles, with their like Kalashnikov and so on. And then in another video, you can see them like just giving Kalashnikov, and then protesters start shooting. You see gunshots, and then police basically and internal troops starting to fall and being shot from the barricade. And this is CNN. This is their video, and they never reported this. Even so, you have basically snipers moving in front of them, and a lot of other journalists. And this is like in front of Maidan stage, so everybody saw this, and hundreds of journalists, Western journalists, and so on. And CNN reported they do not know why government forces retreated. They just reported one member of this group shooting from a hunting rifle. But CNN said they are not able to determine if this were like lethal ammunition or not. But even so, they saw actually this was not one protester. There were like entire group with even Kalashnikov style weapons. This is actually why police retreated. So this is just another evidence which clearly shows that Maidan Massacre was not by the Berkut but by snipers. And also this interesting video by Polish television reporter who was on the Maidan, giving live interview to Polish television, which I also found in my study video appendix, which is available on YouTube. Which also he says basically after first protesters were killed, and after 10 protesters were wounded, he says basically there is a sniper who fires both in the police and protesters. Basically, this is kind of he says this during live television just at the start of the massacre, and then 10 protesters were wounded as well during this time, even before police appeared. Berkut who were armed with Kalashnikovs appears there in this area, and police basically do not charge anybody with their wounded. So then 10 protesters shot, and nobody is kind of wounded, nobody charged with their wounded, and government investigation denies there were any snipers who were shooting kind of protesters besides Berkut. And this is even so, 10 protesters were shot even before Berkut appeared. So they are basically shot by invisible snipers who did not exist according to government investigation, and nobody cares. And even then, about many other protesters who were wounded as well. About half of all protesters who were wounded, 70, close to 70 or more than 70 protesters who were wounded during the Maidan massacre at the same time in the same area in which other protesters were wounded. Nobody charged with their wounding because government investigation determined that they are shot from other locations, from other sectors, from the sector of Berkut. And there were no government snipers at the time. So this means they were shot, basically, even according to government investigation, they were shot by snipers which were located in government kind of areas or buildings, but government investigation denies there were any snipers in this location. So this is just unbelievable how it like primitive and how kind of easy it misrepresent all this evidence, all this all these developments. And this is just one evidence, and there are also a lot of other evidence like forensic investigation. During government investigation, they presented at the Maidan Massacre trial results of forensic medical examinations and ballistic reports, and this evidence shows that actually absolute majority of protesters, almost everybody, were shot from very steep direction. This means their wounds were very steep from top to bottom direction, which means they were facing Berkut on the ground at the same level, horizontal level, but they were shot with wounds from direction, according to forensic medical examination experts, were shot from basically from top to bottom direction, which is very which shows basically they were shot from buildings, which like would match exactly location of Maidan buildings, control buildings like Hotel Ukraina or Bank Arkada and so on. Shotnevi Palace, because also absolute majority of protesters were shot not in the front area, but they were shot in the back, in the back area, or from the side, or left or right side. So this means there were snipers in the left buildings, on the right, and in the back, and only few protesters who were shot from the front. They still were shot because they were running towards Maidan, for instance, or their positions in the video show that they are actually were in position which is consistent with them being shot also from Maidan controlled buildings. And this is kind of also evidence which is kind of forensic evidence, which is criminal level evidence presented by the government investigation. And another evidence, ballistic examination of bullets determines that the first protesters were shot by hunting pellets, like pellets used in hunting against animals, like big animals. They were killed with such ammunition. Even and some other protesters were killed with expanding hunting bullets, which are not used by government forces, but they were killed specifically at the end of the massacre. And this is like never reported by any, again, media. And other, most protesters were shot by bullets which match caliber of Kalashnikovs, but according to government reports, they do not match Kalashnikovs from the Berkut regiment in Kiev. Entire Berkut regiment did not match bullets which were extracted from bodies of killed protesters. According to forensic examination, which relied on automatic system of matching bullets to sample of bullets from a government database. And this is just another evidence that even ballistic examination showed that they were massacred by somebody else and not by government forces. This is just example of such examination. In addition to this CoverUp and stonewalling of evidence, is clear evidence that that this stonewalling and CoverUp of the evidence of the government snipers, as I mentioned already. There is no acknowledgement, even acknowledgement that there were government snipers, there were snipers in Maidan controlled buildings, and even just one example of this, far right, in the moment of this massacre, there was actually a window on the 11th floor in this famous BBC video, which I mentioned, a sniper shooting into the direction of protesters and hotel and BBC crew that actually government investigation revealed that they actually were, this was a room which was occupied then by a deputy of Svoboda, far-right party, and then many other rooms nearby were also occupied by Svoboda. And then you have snipers basically in this floor, and according to my other videos, like CNN videos and other videos which I examined, there you can hear basically snipers running in this on the same floor, 11th floor, doing live stream from the same floor, and it's possible to say that there were Maidan forces, there were Maidan snipers, and so they were located in the same floor. So there is like perfect evidence that there are actually Maidan snipers in these buildings and not any other snipers. So, and they actually massacred Maidan protesters because now we have almost now 8 years since the massacre, and there is no one person who is actually convicted for this Maidan massacre. Even so, this was the most documented case of mass murder in history, which I can say in terms of political mass murders.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I follow your papers and your academic research for many years. I find it very interesting that nobody reports it. And I think this trial revelation and also your research on the Maidan massacre, this is a game changer because of so much forensic, ballistic evidence, medical reports, eyewitnesses, video analysis, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's quite amazing. And it started with a peaceful protest. It started with the desire from the people, maybe caused by many factors like the EU's association agreement, maybe actors like Berezovsky, maybe actors like NGOs and foreign supported actors and so on and so forth, maybe also the financial support by US aid, for example, and many other factors, and also the public will to overthrow this corrupt regime. So it started with a peaceful protest, and then suddenly there was this massacre. And so this is a crucial moment in the whole event, because it changed history and it escalated, and also of course people died. So it's a tragic event also. We should keep in mind that the so-called sniper massacre is a crucial event and a game changer in the Orange Revolution. So it's not like a detail, a small detail. It's very important, and yeah, it's it's amazing. And like you mentioned in your papers, there are different sources contain evidence of shooters or spotters in at least 12 buildings occupied by the Euromaidan opposition, for example, or located within the general territory held by them during the massacre on February the 20th. So including, you mentioned it already, Hotel Ukraina, the Shofnyetny Palace, maybe I pronounced it bad, yeah, Kino Palace and Bank Arcada, and other buildings of the Institutska streets, and yeah, you mentioned also the music conservatory, the trade union headquarters, and the main post office. So yeah, it's evidence all over the place, and I find it quite interesting that also nobody speaks about the far right sector, about the involvement. Does the evidence show that these snipers are people from the far right? Is there any evidence?
So this is kind of very interesting question about actually who were snipers and far-right involvement in this Maidan massacre. And there's a lot of evidence, basically, that snipers included far-right members, specifically from this Maidan self-defense company, which included few snipers who actually publicly admitted that they actually massacred Maidan, that they actually massacred police. And they admitted this in Ukrainian media, publicly admitted, and they are not charged with, basically, they are free still, nobody charged them with this matter, even so they say that on public television in Ukraine, they massacred protesters, they massacred police, and there is no basically persecution, which means they did this not on their own, but they did this as a part of a much larger kind of organization, and this suggested not only far-right involvement in this massacre, but there was also involvement of elements of Maidan leadership. So this was included not only just far-right organizations like Right Sector and Svoboda, because Svoboda controlled Hotel Ukraina, which I mentioned already, 11th floor. Also, there were snipers there in one of the rooms in Hotel Ukraina, controlled by Svoboda at the time of the massacre, and there were a lot of other evidence of far-right involvement. In particular, there was evidence that actually forensic examination by government experts shows that actually in one room which was occupied by German television, public television, ARD was actually shot from the direction of main post office building, which was then controlled by Right Sector, which was then Right Sector headquarters. And this is just one evidence. There were sniper shooting, and another, as I mentioned, another evidence was that protesters testified that they saw snipers on the roof of hotel, not only Hotel Ukraina, but also on the roof of main post office building, which was then controlled by the Right Sector, and they were shooting protesters in particular. And I also found a video, Polish journalist video, which shows actually snipers on the roof of this post office building, kind of shortly after this medic kind of was famously filmed running with blood on her neck and shooting that I was wounded and so on, and tweeting immediately very strange kind of, they mentioned very puzzling kind of, or even kind of hard to believe story, which now kind of suggests that this was fake. And but then was a protester who shot near her, which actually means that they also shot the actual person near her to maybe to give more kind of credence to this. There was a massacre from the same snipers, and then protesters testified that they saw snipers from this building, basically Right Sector headquarters, massacring this protester, shooting this protester. So this is actually kind of evidence that actually there were snipers who were linked to far-right sector. And there is also video of snipers on the roof of this building, but again, government investigation denies this. They say this has never happened. This is just basically kind of hearsay and so on. So which is like you have videos of snipers there on the roof of Zhovtnevy Palace, in Hotel Ukraina, inside of Hotel Ukraina, many buildings, many floors, and so on. And just government investigation denies this. Even so, this is clear evidence. But in addition to this, I think that only far-right members would not have been able to perpetrate such massacre without support and involvement of Maidan leadership, including kind of many elements of Maidan leadership, in particular far-right link associated also oligarchic parties like President at the time and other parties which came to power in Ukraine after the Maidan massacre. And this also very interesting question about if this was done just Maidan itself, but what was the role of Western countries in this massacre, because I also found a very interesting publication by two Ukrainian journalists or writers who are actually twins, and they published this book of interviews about Maidan with Maidan politicians, and in this book they actually say, and in their videos about this book they say basically that two leaders of far-right Svoboda party told them in the interviews that actually about 1 month before the Maidan massacre, after the first protesters were killed in January, end of January, on I think January 21st or around January 21st, they met with a representative of Western country, and this representative from Western country told them that killing a few protesters is not enough, basically that to change policy again of Western policy towards Yanukovych government. So it's necessary to have 100 victims. Then, if there would be 100 victims, only then Western policy would change. And this is kind of evidence that actually, I'm not sure if this was deliberate or not, but this is not coincidental that after this Maidan massacre, we have heavenly 100 created this image of 100 protesters killed. And they could not have exactly 100 protesters because many protesters were wounded. It was possible also to manage this. So included a lot of people actually who were not even on Maidan, who died from like kind of just personal fights or some other kind of clashes in different areas of Kyiv or in other regions of Ukraine without even involved in Maidan, or just die from some kind of infection and so on. They included into Maidan, into heavenly 100. So they had to specifically use this image of heavenly 100 specifically to fit this 100 basically people killed and then almost immediately with the Maidan massacre, Western governments changed their kind of policy towards Yanukovych government, and basically there's a phone call and from Biden to then Yanukovych, basically telling him to basically leave his presidency and to even leave Ukraine, and this is how you have overthrow of the Ukrainian government. And this is admission. This was admission by Biden in his memoirs. So this is not some kind of imagination. This is basically what Biden said in his memoirs. And basically, he told Yanukovych immediately after Maidan massacre to kind of to abandon his position of president of Ukraine and to leave Ukraine. And this is basically what happened. And in addition to this, there are also admissions by 7 Georgians who testify in Italian media, in Macedonian media, television interviews, in this Italian documentary, in Israeli documentary, in Russian media, and they testify also in their depositions. For the Maidan massacre trial, they testified that they actually were members of Maidan groups of snipers, and they said that they actually witnessed as leaders of Maidan and former leaders of Georgia, giving orders basically to massacre both protesters and the police. And they described this massacre that the snipers were located specifically in Georgia, and other snipers from specifically this group, which was led by future member of the Ukrainian parliament, and which was linked to far-right sector. This group was also in the music conservatory, but there were other groups of snipers from other countries as well. They say Lithuanians or Baltic states and so on, in addition to Georgian snipers and snipers kind of from this far-right organization. So this means, and their testimonies are consistent with my research. So obviously, I am not able to determine, like I'm not kind of have evidence. I not investigate specific people and the involvement in the massacre, but their testimony is consistent with the evidence which I mentioned specifically, like about Hotel Ukraine snipers and about snipers located in music conservatory and so on, and how the same snipers massacred police and protesters. So there are kind of testimonies and evidence which they presented also consistent with specific evidence, because they provide very detailed evidence which would be not possible to kind of just fake and so on. And they also provided some verification, some documents like the plane tickets and so on, which shows that they were to Ukraine using fake names, and they were allowed to enter Ukraine without any kind of passport control or border control by Maidan leaders and so on. So this is consistent with my research evidence. And actually, there's also a audio recording of snipers actually shooting during Maidan Massacre. And this audio recording was made by a Maidan protester who was sitting, I think, in McDonald's in the Maidan area, and he recorded this basically snipers shooting. You can hear shooting from snipers and talking about and getting order to shoot. And one of them was speaking not with Ukrainian, he was speaking in Russian, but with heavy Caucasian accent, like Georgian or any other accent from Caucasian Republic. So this also fits massacre, and this happened also kind of at the time when the snipers located in Maidan control areas and also near to kind of protester who was shot and killed on the Maidan. So this is like evidence, this is actually evidence which suggests that snipers were not only far right-wing, but there were other snipers from other countries, and in particular Georgian snipers and very likely Lithuanian snipers and so on. And this is also evidence that many snipers were captured by the Maidan forces, and they were then released by government leadership, by then future Maidan leadership, government leadership, and then by leaders from Maidan, and also by the right sector, because protesters captured snipers along with members of internal troops, and they wanted to kind of put them into Maidan stage and so on. But Maidan leaders came and basically released such snipers and tried to take away them from Maidan, basically by using bus, and protesters wanted to stop the bus, but still Maidan leaders were able to kind of evacuate snipers, and this is just another evidence of how snipers disappeared, because there is no evidence whatsoever of any ground snipers captured or any kind of killed, but there is or wounded. But there is a lot of evidence that actually snipers in Maidan control buildings like Hotel Ukraina and Hotel Palace were captured. Some of them were captured, and they were released or evacuated, and there are a variety of reports that one or two of them were killed by protesters. And their fate is not known, because again, government investigation denies anything like this happened. So this is, even so you have testimonies. So I also collected testimonies of more than 100 video testimonies of eyewitnesses and other witnesses of Maidan Massacre who testified that they saw snipers captured in this Hotel Ukraina, or they saw them evacuated by Maidan leaders and so on. So this is like testimonies, a lot of such testimonies available. So you have just several hundred of witnesses, testimonies, most of them eyewitnesses, who testified that they saw snipers in these buildings, that they saw them captured and evacuated. So this is not just some rumors or some kind of, in the end, this is actually evidence of people who actually can be seen in these videos of the Maidan Massacre. It's possible to see them, like also Maidan protesters trying to search and find the snipers in Hotel Ukraina. So there's plenty of such videos and trying to burn Hotel Ukraina. So this is plenty of such evidence, and this is just basically beyond any kind of doubt that there were such snipers and they massacred Maidan protesters and the police. And actually, recently, my video appendix, which I presented at the conference in Congress in Canada last August, actually was shown. A previous version of this video appendix was shown at the Maidan Massacre trial as evidence. So this was admitted as evidence and shown at the Maidan Massacre trial, even so I'm not involved in any way into this trial, because I try to keep distance, and also kind of I do not provide this video appendix to any site. It is publicly available, so anybody can use this, my research and my evidence, which I found.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's tragic and amazing. Yeah. Also, there is this key actor, Andriy Parubiy, who was commandant of Euromaidan, so he was a coordinator of a volunteer security corps for the mainstream protesters. So, and then suddenly he was appointed Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And this appointment was approved by the president at that time, Petro Poroschenko. So, yeah, and who is this guy? This is a far-right actor. His political affiliations can be traced back to People's Front, Fatherland, and so on and so forth. So yeah, we have this evidence that there is this involvement from the far-right sector, and also as you mentioned, from foreign countries. So yeah.
He was actually also one of the founders and leaders of Social National Party and Party of Ukraine, which are openly neo-Nazi organizations in Ukraine. So, and then only after the Orange Revolution in 2004, he switched to Fatherland Party, but he still had a very strong links to far right. in particular during the Maidan.
And he also quoted, I believe, he was starting an anti-terrorist campaign, which was basically anti-Russian sentiment. So in his eyes, anti-terrorism is anti-Russian. It's like the same thing. Yeah. So I found it very interesting. Maybe we find the answer to this question why the far right is so strong in certain regions of the Ukraine. Maybe we find the answer in your study. And by the way, it was one of the first academic studies examining national attitudes towards World War II in post-Soviet Ukraine. So in this study, maybe we find the answer. Why is the far right sector so strong in some regions in the Ukraine?
We can say that in terms of popular support, far right organizations, including the right sector, and Svoboda Party and other far right organizations like UNAO and so on, they are strongest in the western part of Ukraine compared to eastern Ukraine, if you look for popular support. But still, they are not majority, but support. But far right Svoboda Party was able to come to power basically during local elections in some of parts of western Ukraine, in particular in Galicia, and they still have a control over some cities and some regions of Ukraine even after Zelensky came to power. So this is not accidental, because according to my research, this can be explained by, again, historical legacy and by history and by historical influence of predecessors of far right organizations, in particular, contemporary far right organizations, in particular before World War II and during World War II. And according to my research, and also according to my public opinion polls, which I commissioned for my studies, including this peer-reviewed article on attitudes towards World War II, but also I published another article on peer-reviewed article on attitudes towards the UN and UPA, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which are basically far-right organizations which were active in Ukraine, most active and most influential in Western Ukraine during World War II. And these organizations had basically, I can say that OUN basically was a semi-fascist organization, because it combined fascist ideology and symbols with kind of radical nationalism, and they moved towards more radical nationalism, tried to abandon their fascist ideology and links after the defeat of Nazi Germany in Stalingrad. And this was done for just political reasons, because obviously they wanted to, before this, they actively cooperated with Nazi Germany and their intelligence forces, in particular military intelligence, in establishing of local governments and police forces, and at the start of World War II in Poland, and then in Western Ukraine, which was after the war started in Western Ukraine in 1941 in June, and they were basically also involved in mass murder of Jewish population in these regions, and also in mass murder of prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, and mass murder of also Poles in Volodymyr in 1943 and 1944, and killing of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian civilians who were kind of, for instance, teachers and doctors who were sent from Eastern Ukraine, the ones who cooperated with the Soviet government after World War II. So this is, and they are rely on terrorists and so on, but they were basically, most of their leadership and membership came from Western Ukraine, in particular from Galicia region, which was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, and then was part of Poland until World War II. And this region kind of provided a very strong base for Ukrainian nationalists, in particular for the radical conversion, which was manifested during World War II, and in particular by this organization of Ukrainian nationalists and their paramilitary wing, or their kind of military wing, which was called Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and they were not influential in Eastern Ukraine, and that's why kind of historically far right has a much stronger base in Western Ukraine than in Eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a very interesting research that you do, and also on public opinion, and maybe there is a shift in the public opinion. In the wake of the Euromaidan, the country elected the billionaire Petro Poroschenko, and a big proponent of the EU and NATO. And then in 2019, however, the Ukrainian people, I believe they saw enough. And they elected former comedian Zelensky. So what did this show us? So is there a dissatisfaction, maybe a deep distrust in this Poroshenko regime, or and what did this election tell us about the pro-Western political establishment, and yeah, what is your point on this?
Actually, I also research public opinion in Ukraine before Maidan and after Maidan. And based on my research, I can say this was not accidental, because Poroshenko was one of the leaders of Maidan, so he had public support, in particular after opposition leaders and then government, basically of Ukraine, like Yanukovych and most of his government had to flee Ukraine, because according to a variety of evidence presented at the trials in Ukraine, Yanukovych trials in Ukraine, he was subject to assassination attempts, and that's why he fled after Maidan. That's why he fled Ukraine, because he believed that he would be assassinated. And this was actually the reason why he fled Maidan and Ukraine, and the same was reason for many other of his associates. So after Maidan, the first elections which were held led to victory of Petro Poroshenko, but he was actually also a very interesting case. He was one of Maidan leaders, but also he was one of the founders of Party of Regions, which was kind of in power later during Yanukovych, and he was also a member of Yanukovych government. He was Minister of Economy in the Yanukovych government before Maidan, and then he switched to Maidan after he saw that this kind of Maidan protest started. And so he was not considered to be a radical nationalist, and the reason I think that he was elected by most people who voted for him in the first round, that he promised basically to end war in Donbass, basically in few hours or just very shortly, immediately, and he kind of suggested there would be some negotiations or something like this. So basically people believed that he would be the one who would deliver peace. So this was most important issue at the time. Even so, he was considered to be pro-Western and so on, but he was kind of, like typically for Ukrainian politicians, he was opportunist because, as I mentioned before, he was like in this institute when I cannot even apply to, he was already kind of studying there, because you have to get kind of recommendation from a regional party committee just to enter and to get accepted into Institute of Foreign Relations or International Relations in Kyiv. In the Soviet time, he was then basically a member of Soviet elite, and then he switched to kind of Party of Regions, and then he started to support Orange Revolution, and then he joined Yanukovych government, and then he became one of Maidan leaders. So he was kind of basically a kind of opportunist who decided to support Maidan, and actually he was elected as a result of agreement between oligarchs, because before Poroshenko was running into elections, he was not the most popular politician. There was a Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko, who was mayor of Kyiv, who was most popular politician, and he was one of Maidan leaders, but actually he decided not to run after this. Basically, oligarchs in Ukraine met in Vienna, and they decided to support Poroshenko and to give mayor of Kyiv position to Klitschko. And this is meant that actually a lot of people who voted Poroshenko were not motivated by pro-Western views, but they wanted to support basically peace in Ukraine, and they believe that actually Poroshenko will be more moderate than kind of Parubiy and other kind of more radical leaders of Maidan. And this actually did not happen, because Poroshenko switched immediately kind of to the war. He stopped ceasefire, which was in force, and he tried to use military force against separatists, and then this led to Russian military intervention. So he was not successful in this regard. But his rhetoric was very kind of pro-Western and so on. He promised European Union membership and NATO membership of Ukraine. Even so, my research on this topic showed that there was basically almost no possibility that Ukraine would become a member of EU or NATO for the foreseeable future. This was even before Maidan, and the same conclusion I had after Maidan. So there is nothing in this regard to show that there is any possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of EU or NATO. But Poroshenko actively exposed this, basically because a lot of people believe that if you can become a member of NATO, this would mean like a lifestyle like in Germany or France immediately. So this is like basically, and you can work in basically any country, and then you can give very rich basically, and you can get healthcare service like in France or Germany or Netherlands or Scandinavia and so on. So basically, this looks like communism for people. Basically, that's why people who supported the EU, they actually believe this is like would be basically like paradise or Klondike or something. That's why support for European Union was increased after Maidan, in particular after the Russian Party of Regions was defeated and they fled. So this actually led to a lot of people actually increasing their support for politicians who supported the EU and NATO membership without actually realizing that there was no such prospect. Actually, they were basically lied about such membership and future of membership, and by politicians like Poroschenko, who just wanted to stay in power, and so he would say anything that would get him elected, and that's why he kind of violated his promises to end war in Donbass, and he had opposite policy. But in terms of EU membership and NATO membership, also Ukraine had no significant change in this regard during his presidency. And in 2019, actually, he was defeated in elections, which actually were won by Volodymyr Zelensky, who was also promising basically to end war in Donbass. So this was his main promise, to end war in Donbass, to have peace. And also he kind of emphasized more pragmatic foreign policy and domestic policy compared to Poroshenko, who tried to side with nationalists and tried to pursue very anti-Russian policy. So Zelensky was regarded as a kind of more moderate, in this regard more pragmatic candidate who would kind of resolve this regional divide in Ukraine on this issue of European Union and NATO membership, because still, according to my research and public opinion, there are still differences, very significant regional differences on this issue, and highest level of support for both European Union and NATO membership is in Western Ukraine, and you have slightly more than majority or close to majority in central Ukraine, including Kyiv, but in West and Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine there is strong negative views towards EU and NATO membership, and this, if you include also regions like Crimea and separatist controlled Donbass, this would mean that absolute majority of people in this region would have, of course, like before Maidan, such membership, because they are pro-Russian in terms of their orientation, and so this is like division. And Zelensky actually was considered to be as more moderate in this regard. He got elected by getting support in most regions of Ukraine, but he got highest level of support in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine, and a lowest level of support in Western Ukraine, in particular in Galicia, which was kind of supporting Poroshenko. And Poroshenko was defeated, but actually after election, Zelensky basically tried to follow exactly the same policy as Poroshenko followed, and this was actually very strange because he got elected in a very different program and campaign, and he actually he even promised to arrest Poroshenko and so on, but actually he now switched almost entirely like to Poroshenko policy, kind of, and this policy is even more extreme in some regards, and he openly like calls for Ukraine to become member of EU, NATO, and so on, and uses all this language like Poroshenko trying to present himself as a very hardline nationalist, defender of Ukraine, patriot, and so on. Even so, Zelensky is also basically opportunist, because during Maidan and actually, and even during Orange Revolution, basically Zelensky was not active in politics, supporting kind of political forces of opposition, Maidan opposition, but he was even kind of supporting actually Yanukovych. So this is actually, there's evidence like of campaigning for Yanukovych during the Orange Revolution in 2004, and even then afterwards he was also kind of critical of Maidan and war in Donbass, but when he came to power, he totally switched and become trying to kind of become kind of more pop, more Catholic than even pop. Basically, in this regard, trying to even overdo Poroshenko in his nationalism and kind of publicly saying about EU NATO membership, all this kind of rhetoric, kind of becoming very anti-Russian in this, also in public rhetoric, and this has actually led to his decline in popular support. He's now also become kind of his support decline, and he's now is kind of would like to lose elections if elections would be held, and it would be kind of democratic and free, or relatively democratic and free, because his now public support is about 25%, or 20 or to 25% people who say they would vote for him, and there are now a majority of people who say that they would not support him. So this is actually, he has majority of people now oppose him, and this is like he now became very negative in terms of public opinion. And this means also, even so, he again claims EU and NATO membership and so on. This is not very likely. Basically, this is not likely at all in the near future or foreseeable future for Ukraine.
I understand. Yes. It's also not a surprise that people dreamed of a better situation in the Ukraine, because Ukraine is, after Moldova, one of the poorest countries in Europe. So and it's ruled by oligarchs. So it's no surprise that ordinary people in support of this idea of regime change and dreaming of a better economic situation and political equality, political participation. It's I think it's a good dream. I think it's maybe it's not achievable and realistic nowadays, but yeah. So it's no surprise. And yeah, it's unfortunate that there are politicians who change their opinion, like the weather, and are opportunistic. I think it's very tragic, and they are betraying their own people. But yeah, it's that is politics. So let's move to the last question for this interview. What is your opinion about Crimea? Why is Crimea so important for Putin's Russia? And also, is the annexation justified by humanitarian intervention, or is it just a geostrategical reaction to the West and NATO expansion? And because Putin once said that, I believe he talked about Ukraine is Novorossiya, and he talked that he has to protect his own people, Russian people, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of rhetoric of humanitarian intervention there. But is it justified? Is it an annexation? Is it against international law? What is your opinion on Crimea, and why is it so important for Russia?
This was also a very important issue, which I also researched even before the conflict in Crimea started, before Russian annexation of Crimea. I included analysis of Crimea, conflict in Crimea, and popular views in Crimea about separatism in my articles, peer-reviewed articles, which I published, and also in book, which is based on my dissertation, which is called Cleft Countries, and I compared Crimea with Transnistria region in Moldova and Gagauzia region in Moldova. Because Crimea also included Crimean Tatars, so this was a very interesting case. And when conflict happened in Crimea, this was actually not accidental, because this was very likely to be expected. Because Crimea had a very strong separatist movement during the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a movement for joining Russia in the beginning of 1990s, and political party which came to power in Crimea in the beginning of 1990s was openly calling for such secession from Ukraine and joining Russia. And there was also a referendum for independence of Ukraine or autonomy, for referendums for independence of Crimea or autonomy of Crimea at the late Soviet time, which led to creation of Crimean autonomy, because Crimea before that was just a region, as any region within Ukraine, but it became an autonomous republic. Later in Ukraine, and this actually status was used by Crimea elite basically to maintain a certain distance from policies of the Ukrainian government. And according to my research, even during this time when there was Orange Revolution, in particular during this war in Georgia, when Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, tried to use force against separatists in South Ossetia region, which seceded from Georgia, and then Russia basically intervened, and there was war with Georgia and Russia, and Georgia was defeated. So in this case, according to public opinion polls conducted in Crimea by Ukrainian Institute, which was Pro-Western Institute called the Razumkov Center, there was absolute majority support for either independence of Crimea or secession of Crimea and joining Russia. So even then, and this was after the Orange Revolution, and popular support for independence or kind of joining Russia in Crimea declined when Yanukovych came to power, because he was considered to be pro-Russian. So people then kind of obviously were less likely to support secession or independence compared to 1990s, beginning of 1990s, according to public opinion polls, or during this middle of 2000 after the Orange Revolution, because Yanukovych promised Russian state language and so on, and promised basically closer relations with Russia. And this was kind of led to decline in separatist support in Crimea, but still this does not mean that people just abandon their separatist views. And after Maidan happened, this was very clear, and I mentioned in interviews and publications immediately that Crimea would be kind of hot spot because of very strong separatist views in this region. And this when happened, when these events in Crimea happened, this was kind of, again, very likely kind of not accidental, because of very strong pro-Russian separatist views in Crimea, which are kind of based on the fact that the absolute majority of population in Crimea are Russians, ethnic Russians, and they supported, absolute majority of them supported joining Russia or secession from Ukraine, becoming independent for Crimea, even before Maidan. And after Maidan, this support significantly increased. And this, even ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, majority of them supported either independence of Crimea or joining Russia, even before Maidan, according to this public opinion polls. That's why I wrote in my articles, I warned that basically Crimea is a very important issue for Ukraine, because there were similar conflicts like Kosovo or South Ossetia, which can lead to similar kind of significant conflict in Ukraine. But at the time when I was writing this, making presentation conference, this was considered to be totally kind of outside, unimaginable. So basically people, when I was speaking at a conference, at a lecture, I was giving this lecture at Harvard, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. One former director of this institute even told me not to do research on this topic, because this is very dangerous. So this was essentially dangerous to talk about this topic, because kind of if you do not talk about this topic, this would resolve this issue. And this is like kind of, I was basically a scholar who was researching this kind of and worried about this issue, while many other scholars who were even looking to kind of, with the exception of two other scholars who were looking into regionalism, they consider this is not as dangerous issue for Ukraine. So this is kind of view. And but when conflict in Crimea happened, this actually happened because of very strong pro-separatist views, pro-Russian views, and also because this was important for Russia because of ethnic Russian majority of population in Crimea. And this was kind of one reason why Putin decided to annex Crimea and supported basically pro-Russian orientation of population, but also ethnic Russians in Crimea. But in addition to this, there was other two factors. One, that Crimea is important militarily for Russia. It included naval base for Russian Navy, Black Sea Navy in Sevastopol, which is very important for Russian Black Sea fleet to control this region. And basically, if Crimea allows Russia to control basically most of Black Sea, and it's a very strategic location for this regard. And this was one reason why kind of Putin also decided to kind of annex Crimea after the Maidan. In particular, because he perceived that there would be basically Western U.S. military presence if Maidan would lead to change of government. Then after Maidan, basically the deal which kept Russian fleet would be denounced basically, and instead U.S. military or any other Western military would be located there, and this was considered to be dangerous from military perspective. This would be another reason why Putin supported this kind of annexation. In addition to this, there was also historical issue, because Crimea had a different history. As I mentioned, Crimea was part of the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union until 1954, when it was basically gifted by Nikita Khrushchev from Russia to Ukraine. And this was considered to be a formality basically at the time, but it became important afterwards, because Russian politicians, like for instance Mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, they supported even kind of after independence of Ukraine in 1991, they supported basically separatist politicians in Crimea. And this was kind of issue which still was very significant for Russia, because many Russian politicians did not recognize basically this gift kind of from Khrushchev to basically which was given by Khrushchev. and this was kind of one of the reasons. Another historical reasons, because in terms of history, Crimea is very important for Russian history because of Sevastopol history. Basically, during the Russian Empire, this was place for Crimean War, but also for Sevastopol, which was considered to be kind of a symbol of Russian Navy and Russian military force, and defense of Sevastopol was considered to be important, not only during the Russian Empire, but also during World War II. So there was a lot of historical symbolism for Russia trying to kind of to take control over Crimea, and Russia justifies this by humanitarian intervention, basically saying that they try to protect ethnic Russian population in Crimea, basically. But there was, in particular, from far right and so on, but there was no evidence that actually far right would engage in any genocide or even government of Ukraine would resort to ethnic cleansing. So this was not like a former Yugoslavia. This did not happen in Donbass. So this was not likely to happen in Crimea. But Russian use of humanitarian intervention was also very important, because I want this when similar events happened in Kosovo. So this actually created kind of precedent which could be used by other countries, because annexation of Crimea by Russia is considered to be illegal under international law, similarly to other regions like South Ossetia or kind of independence of South Ossetia or like Kosovo. But Kosovo precedent was important because like Western countries basically use humanitarian justification, humanitarian intervention justification in order to support basically war in kind of war against Serbia and independence or de facto independence of Kosovo, and the kind of declaration of independence without any agreement of Serbian government, which is also considered to be kind of illegal under international law, but was supported by the West. So this was one issue which actually led to basically Russia trying to apply the same principle of humanitarian intervention in violation of international law. And another issue was also similar, because Russia also used this precedent of military intervention to intervene in South Ossetia in 2008 during the war, which was started by Saakashvili over South Ossetia, trying to take control over South Ossetia. And so Russia also basically said they intervened to protect South Ossetians from Georgia. And this was also kind of another example of precedent why this was very important for Ukraine, because if you have two presidents, basically Kosovo and then Russia using this as precedent in South Ossetia, this was again very kind of likely to happen if a similar conflict would take place in Crimea. And when I was talking about this, again, majority of scholars, even scholars who analyze these issues, they consider this like basically Crimea is no longer an issue. There was no separatism and so on, and they try to deny separatism and so on, popular support. Even so, all of the evidence showed that this was opposite, and actually there was strong separatist support, and even so there was decline during Yanukovych. This does not mean that they're actually the same level will be after Maidan came to power. So main reason why Russia acted in this way, basically even so they use this humanitarian intervention, was not humanitarian intervention per se, but actually Maidan, because Maidan led to a restore of the pro-Russian government of Yanukovych, and then this actually considered to be Russia tried to escalate the conflict and respond, retaliate in such a way, basically by using military intervention in Crimea and annexing Crimea. And this is actually showed that kind of Russia joined conflict in Ukraine and did this in response to Western-supported kind of violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government, which was considered to be friendly to Russia.
And if I remember correctly, there was a referendum also.
Yes, there was a referendum. Yes, and this is actually also issue which, when the referendum was conducted, so a lot of media, basically Western politicians, and basically said this was not a real result, this was fake result, because there was like 90% or something support for independence. Even so, obviously, this was not a kind of a referendum which was independently this was legal under international law, but this was consistent with a very high support for separatists, support according to public opinion polls which were conducted at that time before referendum by a variety of companies, and even after a referendum conducted, for instance, by Western scholars who conducted their own public opinion polls in Crimea, still showed very strong support for basically for separatism in Crimea, and the lowest support was among Crimean Tatars, but still basically ethnic Russians, who majority of population, and even ethnic Ukrainians supported. Many of them supported again separatists of Crimea and secession of Crimea, because specifically because of Maidan. This was a similar reaction was in Donbass. So this is actually why this was so important. Maidan had such consequences. Basically, it led to what I predicted, kind of what I warned about. This was similar to what happened in terms of Moldova, but this led to the facto breakup of Ukraine, because now we have annexation of Crimea by Russia and Sevastopol in particular, which was considered to be a separate region under Ukrainian constitution, and also most populated parts of Donbass and the Donbass region, which is also kind of means that a very large part of Ukraine, not only territory, but more importantly in terms of population, basically now not under control of the Ukrainian government, and there are different formations. As a result of this, part is controlled by Russia, and Donbass is controlled. Most of Donbass is controlled by separatists, and this is very similar to what happened in Moldova or to happened in Georgia. And this was again very easy to predict. I was writing about this. That's why I wrote my dissertation, because I was this issue which was very important and concerned me a lot. But again, a lot of people who do not know any kind of background, they kind of still deny any support for separatism in Crimea or even Donbass. They kind of present this basically as very simple. That this or just Russia basically, and kind of basically everything is Russia, and this is not what kind of research shows. This is much more complex issue, and they are not. And Western policy is not kind of just how to say black and white. So this is actually much more complex. A lot of gray areas, and different countries basically supporting their own national interests, and they are not very concerned about Ukraine or future of Ukraine. So actually, Ukrainians have to suffer. A lot of people in Ukraine have to suffer all these conflicts, which actually involve not only conflict between within Ukraine, but also conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and also conflict between Russia and the West over Ukraine. So there are a lot of conflicts basically taking place. In case of armed conflict, you have only armed conflict in Donbass, but it can escalate into other regions as well. If, in particular, if conflict in Donbass again would start, and Russia again, what that they actually would resort to basically open military intervention in Donbass, or even a war with Ukraine, if there would be a kind of attempt to take control of Donbass by force by the Ukrainian government forces. So that's why this very still conflict, which is still very important, and it can escalate any time and any moment. And even in recent weeks, there was actually kind of media reports in the West about Russian media concentration, which were not actually corroborated by the Ukrainian government, but still it shows that this conflict can again escalate very soon, and if it would not be resolved. So that's why it is very important to kind of follow Ukraine and Ukrainian politics, because again, very few people have a very good background and knowledge about this issue. Maidan and so on, or born in Donbass or Crimea, they rely on the media, they rely on politicians, and they do not know actually what's actually going on. That's why it's important to kind of rely on evidence and rely on scholars and concepts by scholars, and not just kind of on other sources which are not considered very reliable.
Yeah, so that's why your study is so important, and it's important to give such scholars a voice, a public voice. So yeah, you can change public opinion on many things. And yeah, it's like you said in the beginning of the interview, it's like more interesting than a Hollywood film. It's like a science fiction conspiracy. It's amazing. It's astonishing, and it's happening right now. It's history in the making. So maybe people in 100 years will talk about it and laugh about it, but now it's tragic. It's weird. Professor Katchanovski, I thank you very much for this long, intense interview, for the knowledge, the studies that you shared with us, and the information that you shared with us. It was a pleasure. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it, and yeah, I hope the audience will like it, and yeah, will be informed, more informed than on mainstream media. So I thank you very much for your time and for your knowledge.
Thank you for very good questions as well.